Thank you, Shaun, for that great job in getting the report across to the folks. Now I'll ask Carolyn and Ziad and Judy and Shaun and Mary Claire to join me here at the podium. This reception by the U.S. government, and particularly by State and Commerce. And I think that Shaun and Chuck have done a great job, both in consulting and then, if I could call it this, socializing the report. But now we've got people here, particularly Judy and Ziad, and perhaps our friends from the private sector as well, could just give us a sense of how you see this report in light of your role and your activities, and how on the business side you see this report as either helpful, harmful, somewhere in the middle. Did we hit the right things? What should we have done perhaps that we didn't do? And perhaps, Judy, I could get you to start off, if you would.
Sure, happy to.
Thank you.
Well, first of all, I wanted to make sure I thank the Chamber and John. It was a great platform, and I wish there were more people here, because it's a really important conversation. Commercial diplomacy is really a topic of the future for America's economic strength and competitiveness globally. So all I can say is tell your friends and spread the news that this is a fundamental way of approaching foreign policy and diplomacy. And commercial diplomacy is really a term of art that I think has found its home thanks to the work of this great team. So there, I want to make sure I thank Ambassador Ford and Ambassador Donnelly for the work they've done on behalf of the Academy. Lino, thanks to you as well, and your great support, and Ron. And I've got to make sure I've mentioned everyone. Great. The Commerce Department really embraces this report. Fundamentally, the organization is about 35 years old. The organization of the U.S. and Foreign Commercial Service is about 35 plus years old. And the heart and soul of commercial diplomacy is what is the guiding light of our efforts overseas when we have officers placed in about 122 locations, 70 plus countries. We are trying to carry out a mission on behalf of American business. And we have always coordinated with the State Department. The question is whether the structural framework is there to really make an institutional relationship permanent. And I think that's what this report has brought to a head. Since even the first drafts have come out, the Office of Commercial and Business Affairs specifically, which Ziad heads, and my office, which is the Office of the Director General for Global Markets, which includes the Commercial Service, and two other programs, Select USA Investment Program and our Advocacy Center. We really have deepened our communication. So let me say you have achieved success, because we are really engaged in a path now where I think the two organizations have really understood that we're leveraging each other and building on strengths into organizations like we haven't before. Secretary Pritzker is aware of this report. In fact, has offered, should there be further discussion and study under the Una Chapman Foundation and the Academy, that she'd be willing to be interviewed and personally engage at a top line. And I want to make sure I made you aware of the secretarial level of interest in the concept of commercial diplomacy. Her public messaging on behalf of the Commerce Department, and I think of the administration, is that commercial diplomacy is foreign policy, which in turn is national security. And that's what I live. I'm a Foreign Service officer, and I've lived in embassies where, in fact, I've experienced the successes and also some of the challenges of blending our two organizations and been able to both achieve successes, and sometimes we've had to struggle to achieve those successes. The framework that Chuck Ford made reference to is number one activity we're going to be engaged in. I would say number two, it's going to be about how we engage the private sector input. Both of our organizations are talking with our own lawyers, but I mean, engaging our lawyers in problem solving of what are the right platforms and opportunities for private sector engagement. You're certainly our clients for either agency. Therefore, we're informed all the time about what the issues and the opportunities you're trying to explore overseas, what they look like. But how do you help shape us? And so that is action number two. Then action three is in the area of sharing the professional development and the human resource intake development, because we haven't really begun that, but we will. because really it is a human resource business, diplomacy. It is really, diplomacy is only as good as an individual who can convey a message meaningfully and have that message understood, and have that message internalized and reacted to by a host government, by a foreign competitor. And that's what we're trying to achieve. So in that regard, and I'll wrap up here, we've taken a few steps already, maybe informed by this report, maybe independent of that report. In the last few months, the Secretary of Commerce announced that we have launched a new Commercial Diplomacy Institute. So this is why this is very timely. It's a project to actually institutionalize the training of commercial diplomacy to our own officers, and that is a best practice we want to share with State Departments, Foreign Service Institute. We have so many conversations that have started and will deepen as we pursue that path. Second of all, conversations about changes in the economy. Are we keeping up? Have we as diplomats, commercial diplomats, really kept up with the speed of business? And in this regard, the digital economy has been an area where Secretary of Commerce has embraced a digital economy leadership team and the development of a digital economy advisory board, both new initiatives of our department. And one of those specific actions under this rubric is the announcement of a new pilot of digital attachés. Now, the reason this is important, and I'm going to stop because I realize now I've gone on a bit, digital attachés is a way for our commercial digital trade officers to be more conversant in the newer issues affecting business. But what I want to say is important here, this launch is completely coordinated with State Department's launch of a digital economy officer program. It is seamless. It was publicly announced together just within the last 2 months. Our training in that specific area is already joint. What we're delivering to our officers virtually right now is being available to the entire digital economy team at Post. So again, Ambassador Pickering, I think the report has already resonated, and some of the steps that we're taking, the first steps are coordinated.
Thanks, Judy. And I think the offer the Secretary has made is an offer we should be rapidly responsive to. And
the clock
I think
is
that
ticking.
we'll think about how we can best do this, but it's very important. Ziad, do you want to talk about it from the state's perspective? And thank you, Judy, very much for your thoughts.
Sure. I have to echo all the thanks. First of all, to you, Ambassador Pickering. For those of you who have gone through the State Department, Ambassador Pickering is a living legend, and I back that up with the fact that there is the Pickering...
You're in deeper trouble than I think.
I back that up with the Pickering Fellows Program, which is just a terrific program, and whenever I'm in grad schools around the country, I always land up meeting with them, but also your continued leadership outside the State Department, and this is just one example. To the authors of the report, to the Cox Foundation, Chamber, the Academy, thank you very much. I think the highest compliment I can pay to a report like this is that, very succinctly, it's forced thought and it's forced action. That's the best way to put it. It's forced thought because in a very short period, we've sat down, Judy and myself, with our respective teams, and had really detailed conversations on every one of the 6 recommendations, thinking about what does this mean? What do we actually, not every single one is as actionable in the time frame that we would like, but even those that we thought we weren't able to necessarily take on immediately, we spent the time to think through them. So I think that's important. And then obviously the action part I'll speak to shortly. I think it's worth just taking a quick step back, as Judy helpfully did from Commerce's perspective, to talk about some of the things that we're doing at State in this area. Obviously our top line here is the fact that Secretary Kerry, right from the onset, has made the point that foreign policy is economic policy is foreign policy. And he's talking there about what Ambassador Pickering talked about, that these things are inextricably linked. And chiefs of mission and ambassadors like Ambassador Pickering know that as a fact of doing business. My office, the Commercial Business Affairs Office, a number of members of my team are here as well, has a very simple mandate. It's promoting U.S. commercial interests overseas and making sure that their concerns are integrated into our foreign policy specifically. So how do we do that? 3 quick ways. One is kind of classic advocacy, where we work with the Commerce Department on the advocacy center process and make sure that folks in our building, principals in our building, are using those important foreign engagements to advocate for our companies. Just an example, last month, Secretary Kerry visited a country in the Middle East. Right before then, a company raised an ongoing procurement issue that they were having Literally within 48 hours, we managed to have him issue a letter that was sent out to the defense minister. And 2 days later, he was on the ground and raised those points directly with the defense minister. So the point I'm trying to make here is that this is buy-in at the highest level of our building about the importance of advocacy, about the importance of championing our companies. And I think that's a point that is worth underscoring, because it's literally the way in which the State Department is doing business, and our secretary has been setting a very strong example on that. In addition, on the advocacy side, we also do a program that I think is worth flagging here called Direct Line, which basically connects US companies here in the United States with chiefs of mission overseas. We do these calls quite frequently, and they range from everything from energy in Oman to construction in Nicaragua to we have an upcoming one with Pakistan, and more innovative ones with our colleagues in commerce. For example, what does World Bank procurement reform mean for US companies? What are the opportunities there? So, we've done hundreds of these calls over the past several years, and it's really about providing market intel, commercial intel to our firms with an emphasis on SMEs, those who aren't quite able to access these markets and our chiefs of mission so readily. So I think that's a very important part of what we're doing on the advocacy. I would also just make the point to what Chuck said about policy advocacy, because ultimately, we can have a multiplier effect, a force multiplying effect, if we're not just doing one-off advocacy, but if we're pushing those for those high standard platforms. I'll give you a few quick examples that have come up just in my own work in the last couple of months. Yesterday, I was in Berlin, where I was primarily focused on selling TTIP to a European skeptical audience, or at least in Berlin, there's a fair bit of skepticism. Meeting with German press, speaking at the OSCE plenary on similar issues. 2 weeks ago, I was in China, and before that in India, pressing the bet. Critically important for US commercial interests in those countries to have a fair, level playing field. TPP, as you know, we're making the case around the country and in Asia as well. These are advocacy platforms of the highest order. They allow our companies a way to do business that it can be transformative, and that makes our work easy because it's not just one-off advocacy. And then just the third area that we didn't quite touch on, but it's very close to my heart, is the idea of public-private partnership, not just for commercial purposes, but for foreign policy and policy purposes in particular. What do I mean by that? Just last month, I was in this room meeting with leading US businesses to talk about their role in partnering with the State Department on anti-corruption efforts. 2 days ago, I was meeting with German and American companies about the role of the private sector in dealing with the refugee crisis. So I think although we're focused on commercial advocacy, the commercial diplomacy part of this, and we all have different terminology that we use, is really about how can government and business work together, not just from a bottom line job creation point of view, but from a policy point of view. So having said that, just as context, let me just say a couple of things that we are acting on in conjunction with our friends at Commerce. The first thing that came across very clearly to me was that the value of this report was so strong that it needs to be an ongoing process where we receive this type of input. And this really came from a conversation that Carolyn and I had as part of a broader group discussion, that if you look at some of the advisory boards that we have set up at State and Commerce, there's a lot of value we get in terms of industry and trade issues, but there isn't really that kind of sharp perspective on how we're doing in commercial diplomacy. One of the things that we're exploring, at least within the state side, is that we have an advisory committee on international economic policy that sits in our economics bureau. It has a number of subcommittees, but none that deals with commercial diplomacy specifically. And so what we are aiming to set up in short order is just such a subcommittee that would allow us to have this conversation not once a year, but 4 or 5 times a year, and have the thought input of the private sector and others play into that. So that's one actionable thing that we're taking away and we're trying to put in motion. And I know our colleagues at Commerce are doing similar things. Number 2, in terms of the training point and how do we incentivize economic officers and build their capacity within the building, I'd point to a few things that are in motion through the QDDR process. That's an internal process we have to review our diplomacy and development efforts. As part of that, we've set up something I think that's very important for businesses to know, which is that in each regional bureau at the State Department, there's a designated economic deputy assistant secretary. So in the Europe Bureau, there is a point person, a DAS level person, who is focused just on economic issues. That's another very important way of organizing ourselves to integrate economic issues within the regional bureaus that have a significant policy driving effect in our building. We've increased detail leads through the Eagleburger program to the private sector and within the interagency to OPIC and USTDA. And here I want to point to Sandra Campbell and our team, who I call the shining example of state and commerce partnership. Sandra's a great point about how we're trying to cross-fertilize, not just with the private sector, but within the government, between state and commerce. She works with the USIAC office, the U.S. Export Assistance Council office in Tampa, so she's part of the commerce DNA. She spent the past 6 months in our office at State CBA and has done terrific work. So we're continuing to find those types of opportunities. And then let me make one other point, and then I can come back to a few of the other ones. I think all of this has to start at the source, which is FSI, where our officers, Foreign Service officers, are trained. And this report has triggered a very good conversation about how FSI can work better with Commerce's new institute, but also how do we make sure that the private sector is engaged more with the FSI training curriculum process. Now, in a sense, there isn't a problem here to be dramatically fixed because we constantly have private sector speakers coming through and so on. But we are going to be trying to find ways to, in a more systematic way, have companies, associations come through FSI and kind of give their top line perspective on the curriculum that we're using and how they think that is actually serving companies in the field itself. There are a number of other things on the FSI side that I'll come back to, but for now, let me just stop and say thought and action, both in motion, and my sincere thanks to you all for the good work that you've done to get us doing both of those things.
Thank you, Ziad. I want to get to questions from the floor, but I'd like to hear from Mary Claire about how she sees this report and how it affects the view of her firm on the role and place of the U.S. government in supporting, and then I'll turn to Carolyn. Then we'll go to the floor, and Shaun, I'll give you a few seconds somewhere here in the floor. Mary Claire?
Well, it's a huge honor to be asked to participate in this forum, and certainly I'm in the Washington office of the Textron Corporation, which is a multi-global, multi-industry global company of which Bell Helicopter is one of our most powerful brands. And I think I was asked to come here today to talk about our recent very successful experience with commercial diplomacy in Japan. And I would be remiss without thanking all the people in this room that I see, many of which are here today, certainly Ziad's and Judy's teams at Commerce and State. I know Konstantin Dubrovsky's here, Jen Pilot, Ira Shapiro. There were many people on this team that were invaluable. First and foremost, we are very pleased that the American Academy of Diplomacy, with the support of State and Commerce, issued this report, because we certainly know that we cannot be successful without the help that you all lend us. And it is crucial to our success overseas and building our company globally to have the intel and feet on the ground, ears on the ground, and that you all provide, the State Department and Commerce. Our experience in Japan in 2015, we partnered with Fuji Heavy Industries to submit a proposal to compete for 150 utility helicopters in Japan for the Japan Self-Ground Defense Force. In short, we submitted the bid in June and last summer, and we're told we expected the Japanese Ministry of Defense to issue a decision in August, which is unheard of in a proposal of this size. We immediately got our ground game together and went out to our colleagues, certainly the Commerce Department of Advocacy team, the Bureau of Economic at State, the team on the ground at the embassy in Tokyo. It was really one of the best collaborative and timely experiences that I think I've ever seen in my experience. We had all of our colleagues around in government were willing and able to go to their counterparts on a timely basis, and it was and it was quick, and we were so surprised at when we won the winning bid. We had the highest levels of support from Secretary Kerry, Secretary Pritzker. It was just very much a textbook case. Of course, we're honored Textron and Bell Helicopter. We've had a 6-decade successful role in Japan. And certainly Bell products have been there with serving in natural disasters, and over 1,500 airframes flying in the country. But we know that this will provide a long-term global support for both Bell and Fuji, and a success long-term in building on our global brand.
Thank you. Carolyn.
Great. Thank you. And I'm just going to say ditto to all the thank yous that have been said already. This has been a wonderful journey for me personally, and I think a wonderful success story for the Cox Foundation. So thank you for that. Let me put my P&G hat on first to say we are one of the world's largest consumer products companies. We touch more than 5 billion consumers in the world with our products, manufacturing in 70 countries, selling in 180. Needless to say, we are big users of the State and Commerce Department and the other U.S. government agencies that provide commercial diplomacy support. So it's very gratifying to see so many great ideas come out of this study. It really was born from a conversation, many conversations I've had with my counterparts who both work in Washington but over and in the fields. And realizing that we are in an enormously competitive environment now, 24/7 clock that we work on. We see our foreign competitors and the kinds of support they get from their governments. And despite the fact that I think the US government has grown tremendously in terms of its capability to service business, is still falling behind. I was around in the town when Larry Eagleburger, as Secretary of State in 1991, issued his business manifesto, which was the beginning of a new era of business-government cooperation. But the world is a very different place than it was in 1991, and we need to get our collective act together. So what we've seen as a result of this report, providing a catalyst for more State Department, Commerce Department collaboration, is enormously satisfying. And I would just say that there's a number of very actionable things that I think have come out of the early discussions that the business community can help with implementing. The idea of the private-public partnership, particularly in terms of providing better support and training at the two academies now, is really a big idea. There's not enough resources in the US government to bring in the best and the brightest, but if we can partner more closely together and figure out a legal way to do so, and I believe there is, we can really actually share a lot of our best practices and knowledge from the private sector in areas like electronic commerce, which is exploding in our business. 40% of our sales in South Korea are on the internet now. These are skills and this deep understanding of how these new technologies work and how these changes are impacting the global economy is something that every Foreign Service officer needs. I think the business community can help provide that kind of training and support on a real-time basis, and also be continually updating that as we move forward. So I'm going to stop there. I think it'll be interesting to take some questions, but just to say again, thank you. I'm really excited about the opportunities for us to work together.
Thanks, Carolyn.